Hello everyone and welcome back to the YellowDog 3D tips blog. Today I'm going to be showing you how we can bring a 2D image to life using projection mapping. So we can make a 2D image look as though it was shot as video. So let's begin. First off, I'm going to start in Photoshop, and this is the image that we're going to be working with, and what we need to do is start separating things off and painting backgrounds. So to begin, I'm just going to navigate over to this sign, if I can get there. I'm a bit lost. There we go. So I'm just going to draw around this road sign and I'm going to extract it onto a new layer. So to do this, I'm going to use the pen tool and I'm just going to draw around the outside just like a roto. I'm using the pen tool just because you can get nice smooth edges, and it allows you to feather it as well. So I'll just speed this up because nobody wants to watch this. So there we are, we've drawn around the whole road sign now, and the next thing we need to do is just right click on the path. Sorry, I'll just fix that point. Right click the path and go to make selection, and I'm just going to feather my selection by 1 pixel and press OK. You can take anti-aliased if you want less jaggy edges, and I'm just going to press Command J or Control J and just duplicate that onto a new layer. So that looks like a really clean cutout to me. So what we can do now is actually Command or Control click on that layer in the little box that I just clicked, and go back to the background layer and just press Shift and F5, and that's going to bring up the content aware fill options, and this just adds you a really good starting point to painting out this background. So we want to make it look like the sign was never there, and to do that I'm just going to use the clone stamp tool. So if you press Alt on your keyboard, select a point to sample from, and we can just start cloning over parts of the background. So this is one of them things where the more time you spend on it, the better it's going to look. But you also want to sort of plan out the camera move of your shot before you start doing this, so you know which areas to really focus on. I know that we're going to see quite a lot of this background when we move the camera, so I'm going to make sure that we've got at least a decent amount of it painted in. Again, I've sped this up so it's not as boring to watch. So I think that's an okay starting point. I would definitely spend longer doing this than I've just spent. So here is my final, which I'm going to use for the projection map. So I can go through the layers and show you what I've painted out. So obviously there's the sign. I've extracted this side object. I've extracted this little box that was on the ground. So I can project that out later onto 3D geometry. I've also got rid of this whole top segment, and I've also painted out the fence which runs up the side of the road. And you decide which things you're going to extract by sort of guessing how much sort of parallax and movement is going to be on them. So the next step is just to save these out with their transparency. So I'm just going to use this sign layer now, and I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm just going to select a appropriate folder. I'll call that Projections, and I've spelled it wrong, doesn't matter. I'm just going to call this sign. Always give them meaningful names so it's easier in cinema. I'm going to save it as a tiff format and uncheck layers because we don't need those, and I'm going to make sure save transparency is definitely ticked, and just click OK. And we need to do that for all of our layers that have transparency, so all the cutouts, but it is a good idea to save out your painted background as well, because you're going to need this later on. And you don't need to save out the original because you should already have it somewhere. So now we're going to jump into cinema and start with the fun part, but before we do any of that we need to set the resolution of our scene. So just get this from your photograph or whatever still you're using. So I just remembered mine, so I've inputted that, and first thing I'm going to create a camera. I'm going to go to tags, cinema 4D tags, and camera calibrator, and under the image we're going to select our original image, so not the painted background, just the original. So it's the all.tiff. So there we go, there's our original image, and we need to make cinema understand where the camera is and how it's oriented, and we can go to the calibrate tab to do that. So this is going to allow us to draw lines on our axes. So I've just clicked add line, and I'm going to move that to a line that I definitely know is the x-axis, so it's going across. So to tell cinema what axis this is, you can press shift and click on it, and it's going to cycle through red, green and blue. Red is X, green is Y, and blue is Z. So I'm going to put another x-axis in here. So I've just drawn that where I know is sort of horizontal, and shift clicked once. So now I'm going to attempt to add a z-axis, and I can sort of see a line on the ground that I know is sort of quite clear and is going to be quite straight. So I'm just going to align it with that and shift click 3 times, and that's now a Z axis. I'm going to make a Y axis now because we can see that these pillars go directly upwards. So just moving those into place, aligning them with that upwards position. Shift click twice, now that's the Y axis. And you can see that it's solved the X vanishing point already, and we're going to want all of these boxes to say solved. So we need to keep adding more information and telling Cinema what's what. So I'm going to align this lamppost with the Y-axis, and you can see that's done quite a lot already. So we might not need that much more now. I will add another, let's say, another Y-axis here, and shift click twice. And if we click add pin, that's going to set the origin of the scene, so you have to drag that to the end of one of these lines, and that's just told Cinema to put the center of the grid on that point. So I think that's solved. It seems to look alright to me. I'm going to add a plane in just on the ground, just so we can see how it looks, and that's looking okay, but we can see it further by if I drop a background into the scene, and I'm going to texture that with a image of my background. So if I copy the image from here, and we'll go into the background texture, and we go into the luminance. We always want to be putting our textures in the luminance when we're doing this, and it's not let me paste it in, so I'll just load it in instead. I don't know why that happened. So that actually doesn't look right to me, so we're going to have to go back into the camera calibrator and calibrate it a little bit further. So there's one more trick I didn't show you here, and that's to add a grid. And what this grid allows us to do is align 2 different axes within the one grid. So I'm going to align this with the pillar, so because we know that there's a definite x-axis and a definite y-axis there. So I'm just going to make this fill the whole pillar. And again, you just shift click each axis to tell it what's what. So if I shift click the x-axis here, it's going to tell it that's the x, and we'll do that with the y-axis. So that's looking good. You can see that more things have just corrected themselves, and I'm going to add one more grid, and I'm going to try and align one with the ground now. So just putting these points on a definite x-axis, and I'm going to try align the z-axis with this. So this is a bit risky because I'm sort of doing it by eye, but I think it'll be okay. We can always delete it if it messes things up a bit too much. So just trying my best here to make it look as though this grid aligns with the floor. It's probably best to move it to the edge of these things. I don't know if they're grids on the floor or something. They look like they'll probably be parallel. So I'll set that as the z-axis, and the x, I'll set that up as well. And I'm now going to add just one more line, and that's another z-axis line, because I spotted a sort of parallel line that runs across this sort of bridge. So just get it as bang on as you can, and I will click this 3 times, shift click this 3 times, and it looks as though that's going to do the trick. So yeah, if I just look at this ground plane now, it looks as though that's in place. I'll actually be able to see this a little bit easier if I look at the wireframe view. So if I go to display and lines, so that looks pretty spot on to me. I think if I make this plane smaller, you'll see the lines in it a little bit clearer. So I'm just going to change the width and height to 20, and that looks pretty spot on to me. I think we'll stick with this for now. So now we've got our camera in position, we can start making the ground plane. So I'm just going to extend this plane up to the horizon line, so just around there. And it's a good idea now to lock the camera or save your scene now that you've got the camera positioned. So I'll just save that out, and now I'm going to think about adding in some geometry for this back building. So in our background material, I'm just going to change this background texture to our painted background so I can see beyond the obstructing objects. So I'm going to make a cube which will sort of represent this building. So I'll just extended the ground plane slightly further. So that's a bit too much, I'll just refine that. So I'm just going to create a cube now. And this cube is far too big, so I've just made it 10 by 10 by 10, and I'm going to start to move it along the z-axis. So I'm just going to go to my split view and move this back in the z-axis, because it's a bit too difficult to do that in the perspective view. But also it's important to make sure that this cube is touching the ground plane, so I'll just press S to make that full screen, and there we have it. I've just made it touch the ground plane. So you can tell when this is in position because the bottom line of the cube should be touching the base of the building. So if I could just keep moving it back in Z space until it's aligned with the bottom of it. So now I know that it's definitely in the right Z position. I can obviously scale it. So I'm just going to scale that upwards so it fills the building. So I'm just refining that now, making sure it's just the right scale. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, and the edges don't have to be perfect because we're going to be projecting our textures with an alpha channel. And it also doesn't matter too much if it protrudes through the ground plane because that is going to be covered up anyway. So now that I'm happy with the position of that building, I'm going to start adding in some geometry for the overpass. So I'll just get my 4 views, and I've just duplicated that back building, and I'm just going to move them down to the ground plane so I can easily position where the overpass geometry is going to go. And I'll call this piece of geometry overpass cube. And for reference, I'm going to move this over to the base of where these pillars are. So yeah, just aligning that front line of the cube with the base of the pillars. I can disable the other geometry to easily see it. And it looks a little bit off, so I'm going to go back to my split view. I'm going to move it forward a little bit, and that looks like it's almost aligned. So now that I know that's in the correct Z position, I can begin scaling it. So I'm just looking for that piece of top geometry where the pillars sort of meet. And so just scale that into position. I don't actually have to be too accurate here because it's quite in the background. It's going to be occluded by other objects, but I'll get it as close as I can be bothered to. So that looks good to me. So we just need to go through the whole scene and start adding geometry where we need. So I've just created a cylinder that's going to represent those pillars, and just scale it down so we can see it in the viewport. So I'm just going to scale the radius down a little bit further than that, and I'll go to my split view again and start moving it back in the Z position. Actually I need to go to the 4 view because I didn't align this with the ground plane. So all I need to do now is align the front of this cylinder with the base of the pillars. So if I go to my split view again and get it to around here, that looks aligned to me. And now we can begin scaling the cylinder because we know that it's in the right depth position. So I'll just refine it a little bit further before I begin scaling, and just move that down into position, and that's looking pretty good. I can duplicate that over by pressing Control and moving the transform. So we've got those 3 pillars in now. So I'll just add a little bit more geometry for this back area of the overpass. So I've just duplicated my overpass cube, and I'm just going to move it into position and scale it a little bit. So that's looking pretty good. But also I'm going to move this one forward a little bit just to add a little bit of parallax when the camera moves. So that looks pretty good. And just looking at this building on the right hand side, we might just be able to duplicate our left hand building. So I'll just make that visible, and I'm just going to dupe that one over to the right hand side and just make sure the edges align. So that's looking pretty good. I'm just going to scale it in the Z as well. So somewhere around here looks okay to me. And that's just going to add, again, a little bit of that parallax when the camera moves. So I'm going to make a new piece of geometry which catches everything that doesn't have geometry, so everything in the far background. So I've just duplicated this left building, and I'm going to put that really far back and just scale it so it's huge. And it's just going to catch anything in the background, such as the trees, anything like that. So now's a good time to start adding in some textures. So actually the quickest way of doing this is just to get my folder with the textures in it, and just select all of the ones with transparency and just drag them into the texture pane. So there we go. You can see that each of the textures is loaded into the color channel. So we can sort these out in a minute, but I'm also going to drag in my painted background, so the background without all the objects in. So what I actually need to do is copy the color value into the luminance channel, and that's just going to make it look correct. So I've just dragged that onto the back building, and what we need to do is go into the texture tab and change the projection mode to camera mapping, and then drag our calibrated camera into the camera field and click calculate, and that's just going to project the texture through the camera onto the geometry. So I've just duplicated that onto all of the pieces of geometry which I've made. So you can see when I render it, it starts to look correct. If we look through the perspective view, you'll see that we've got our buildings in place, and this overpass looks a little bit off to me, so I'm just going to move it back so that it's overlapping with the top of these pillars. So that's looking pretty good. You can see that the projection is working correctly, and you can fine tune the positions of the geometry after you've projected the texture. and get things sort of looking bang on. So I'm pretty happy with the look of this. You see that the background's been projected onto that back far plane. So for now I'm just going to turn off all the geometry, and I'm going to retexture this background with the full image, so not the painted background, just the original. And I'm doing this so that I can position the rest of the geometry in the scene. So I'm going to focus on this sign for now, and I think this sign can just be a plane because we're not really going to see the edges of the sign because it's so thin. So a plane will just work perfect. I'm going to scale the plane down, and I need to rotate it along the x-axis 90 degrees, so it's sort of flat onto the camera and just points upwards like the sign does. So just holding shift and rotating, and again it's 90 degrees. Again I need to align this with the ground plane just so that we can move it back in the Z space and see if it's in the correct position. So I've just gone into wireframe mode. I'm going to move it back so that the bottom of this plane aligns with the base of the sign, and we can begin scaling it once we're happy with the position. So that's looking like it's in the correct position to me. I'm going to move it across in the x-axis, and I'm just going to start now scaling down. So it doesn't have to match the sign perfectly, because remember we're going to be projecting with alpha channels, so it's going to sort of cut round for us anyway. So as long as it's in the correct depth space, you're good to go. So we need to sort out this texture for the sign, so I just need to find the sign texture first. So there it is, sign.tiff. I'm going to copy the texture value from this and put it into the luminance channel, into there, and we also now need to paste this into the alpha channel so it cuts around the sign for us. So you can see it's cut around it in the preview there. So I'm going to select the plane, I'm going to call this sign, and I'm going to drag the texture straight onto there. And again we need to set up the projection mode. So I'm just going to go to my shaded view so I can see if it's working, and I'm just going to disable the background so I can see whether it's working. You can see that the sign's there, but it's not the correct scale, so we can fix that by going into the projection, changing it to camera mapping, and dragging our calibrated camera into the camera field and clicking calculate. You can see that that now is in the correct position and it renders perfectly with the alpha channel. So I'll just show you that in the perspective view. Select the sign and press S to make it full screen in the viewport, and you can see we've got a lovely cutout now of this sign, and it looks pretty flawless, like the edges look nice, everything like that. And we now need to do this for every one of our transparent textures. So here you can see I've added in lots of geometry for the scene. They're just basic pieces of geometry such as cylinders and planes. So if I go to my textured view and show you what's going on, I've projected out all of these textures just like I did with the sign. I've copied the color value into the luminance and alpha channel for all of them. And if I hit render, you'll see we just see our original image. So I'm now going to add in some camera motion to see what it looks like. So I've just duplicated the calibrated camera, and you'll see if I try and move it with the calibration tag on, it just doesn't move like you would expect. So we need to delete the calibration tag off this camera. Just make sure you do not move the projection camera, because that's just going to mess up all the work that we've done so far. So just move a separate camera and leave the projection camera where it was. So I'll just move the camera forward and hit render, and you see that all the projections have stuck, and it looks as though we have a 3D scene from a 2D image. I've added in little details such as the little box on the floor, and it's just little details like that that are going to really help sell the shot. So I've just rendered a little sequence of what we just made, and you can see everything's looking great. Like, can't really see any problems with it. The only problems I can see is sort of with this overpass. I could have added more geometry in here. I've just used a flat plane for this, but it definitely would have looked better if I'd gone to the effort of modeling geometry for all that stuff. But that's basically all there is to it. It's not very complicated. It is quite time consuming though, but I think the results that you can get from such a simple technique are really quite impressive. So once again, thank you for watching. This has been the YellowDog 3D Tips blog. Stay tuned for more 3D tips. Cheers!